When the lawyer read my father's will, my wife Linda smiled, and my brother Gary nodded knowingly. I let my face crumble into devastation, my hands shaking as I whispered, "This can't be real." Everyone in that mahogany-paneled office turned to stare at me with expressions of pity and awkward sympathy. Nobody had a clue I'd been planning this moment for 6 months. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button. My name's Frank Morrison, and I'm about to tell you how I discovered my entire family had been lying to me for 8 years. But here's the thing. I've been lying right back to them for the last 6 months. And today, at my father's funeral, was when the real show began. "I'm sorry, Frank," said Mr. Patterson, Dad's lawyer for 30 years. "I know this comes as a shock." He adjusted his glasses nervously. "But your father was very specific about his wishes. The will was clear. Dad's entire estate, the house in Denver worth $800,000, his investment accounts totaling $1.2 million, and his life insurance payout of $300,000 was going to Linda and Gary, my wife, and my younger brother. Not me. Not a single penny." "I don't understand," I managed to choke out, which was partially true. I understood perfectly, but I'd been practicing this reaction in my bathroom mirror for months. "Why would Dad cut me out completely?" Linda reached over and took my hand. Such a loving gesture. Such complete bullshit. "Honey, I'm sure there's been some mistake," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Your father loved you." Gary cleared his throat. At 52, my brother had always been the charmer of the family. Smooth talker, easy smile, the kind of guy who could sell ice to an Eskimo, or convince an elderly man to rewrite his will. Frank, maybe Dad was confused near the end. You know how he was getting forgetful. Right. Dad's mind had been sharp as a tack until the day he died. Sharp enough to tell me exactly what my loving family had been up to when I visited him in the hospital 6 months ago. Sharp enough to show me the emails on his laptop. Sharp enough to help me plan what happened next. "The will is dated and witnessed correctly," Patterson continued. "Signed just 3 months ago. Your father stated that he believed his assets would be better managed by Linda and Gary, given their, and I quote, demonstrated financial responsibility and family commitment. My son Kevin, 26 and supposedly the responsible one, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. My daughter Sarah, 24 and fresh out of college, stared at her shoes. Both of them knew. Of course they knew. They'd probably been in on it from the beginning. "There has to be something we can do," I said, letting my voice crack just right. "Some way to contest this?" Patterson shook his head. "I'm afraid not, Frank. The will is ironclad. Your father was of sound mind, and he made his intentions very clear." I stood up abruptly, knocking over my chair. Perfect dramatic effect. "This is insane. 8 years I took care of him. 8 years I drove him to doctor appointments, managed his medications, handled his finances." My voice rose to just the right pitch of devastation and betrayal. "And he leaves everything to them?" "Frank, please," Linda said, standing and reaching for me. "We'll figure this out. We're family. Family." The word tasted bitter. But I let her pull me into a hug, feeling her trembling slightly. Whether from guilt or excitement, I couldn't tell. Probably both. "I need some air," I mumbled, pulling away. "I need to think." I stumbled toward the door, playing the part of the devastated son perfectly. Behind me I could hear hushed whispers starting up. Planning, no doubt, celebrating quietly. Figuring out how to comfort poor betrayed Frank while they counted their newfound millions. Outside in the parking lot, I sat in my Honda Civic, 15 years old but reliable, just like everything else about dependable Frank Morrison, and let myself smile for the first time in months. The real smile, not the fake one I'd been wearing like a mask. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd pulled off the perfect crime. Manipulated a grieving elderly man, isolated him from his older son, convinced him to leave everything to the people who really cared about him. What they didn't know was that Dad and I had been planning this moment since March. What they didn't know was that every single one of their lies had been carefully documented, recorded, and preserved. What they didn't know was that Frank Morrison, boring accountant and devoted family man, had spent 30 years learning exactly how money really worked, how assets could be moved, hidden, and protected. And what they especially didn't know was that Dad's will was just the opening act. I started the car, and drove home to the house I'd shared with Linda for 27 years. The house where she'd been sneaking around with my brother. The house where my children had looked me in the eye every Sunday dinner and pretended everything was normal. Time to see how good they were at pretending when the real pressure started. I pulled into my driveway 20 minutes after everyone else got home. Through the living room window, I could see them all gathered around the kitchen table. A family meeting. How touching. I sat in the car for a moment, watching them through the glass. Linda pacing, her hands gesturing animatedly. Gary leaning back in his chair with that satisfied smirk I'd grown to hate. Kevin nodding along, the dutiful son. Sarah twisting her hair the way she did when she was nervous. They were probably planning how to break the news to me gently, how to help poor Frank cope with his devastating loss, how to convince me that this was somehow for the best. I walked in through the front door, letting it slam a little harder than necessary. "Frank," Linda called from the kitchen. "Is that you, honey?" "Yeah, it's me." I tried to sound defeated. Not hard, really. I'd had plenty of practice feeling defeated over the years. They all looked up when I entered the kitchen, 4 faces arranged in expressions of concern and sympathy. If I hadn't known better, I might have believed they actually cared. "Dad?" Sarah stood up and hugged me. "I'm so sorry about Grandpa's will. It doesn't make any sense." Sweet Sarah, my little girl. Except she wasn't little anymore, and she hadn't been innocent in a very long time. "Thanks, sweetheart. I know you didn't know anything about this." She pulled back, and I caught the flash of guilt in her eyes before she looked away. Oh, she knew all right. "Sit down, Frank," Linda said softly. "Let's talk about this." I slumped into my chair at the head of the table, the same chair I'd sat in for thousands of family dinners, thinking I was the patriarch of a loving household. The irony wasn't lost on me. "I still can't believe it," I said, shaking my head. 30 years I worked as an accountant. 30 years of managing money, saving for retirement, planning for the future. And my own father didn't trust me with his estate. Maybe he was trying to protect you, Kevin offered. You know, from the stress of managing all that money. Protect me from stress. I almost laughed out loud. Kevin had been unemployed for 6 months, living in our basement, and he was worried about me handling stress. Or maybe, Gary said slowly, he wanted to make sure the money went to people who really understood family values. There it was, the first real hint of their true feelings. Gary's voice had just a trace of smugness, quickly covered, but unmistakable. "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked. "Nothing, Frank. I just meant," Gary waved his hand dismissively. "Dad always appreciated how much Linda helped take care of him. All those visits to the nursing home, all the time she spent with him, visits to the nursing home, right. The same visits where she and Gary had been working on Dad, slowly poisoning him against me, telling him stories about how I was too busy with work, too selfish, too focused on money to really care about family. Linda did help a lot, I admitted, because she had, just not in the way Gary meant. And you know how close Gary and Dad became these last few years, Linda added, especially after Gary lost his job. Dad really admired how he was getting back on his feet. Gary had been getting back on his feet for 3 years now, ever since his construction business went under. Coincidentally, right around the time he started spending more time at our house, more time with Linda. "I'm sure Dad had his reasons," I said quietly. "I just wish I knew what they were." "The important thing is that we stick together as a family," Linda said, reaching across to squeeze my hand. "Money doesn't change that. Money doesn't change that." Spoken like someone who just inherited $2.3 million. "You're right," I said. "Family is what matters." Sarah smiled at that, the tension leaving her shoulders slightly. Kevin nodded approvingly. Gary leaned forward with what I'm sure he thought was a brotherly expression of concern. "In fact," Linda continued, "Gary and I were talking, and we want you to know that just because Dad left the money to us doesn't mean we're going to forget about you. We're family. We take care of each other." Take care of me. How generous. I wondered what percentage of my father's money they were planning to throw my way to keep me quiet and grateful. "That's very kind," I managed. "I appreciate that." "We were thinking," Gary said, "maybe you could help us manage the investments. You know numbers better than anyone. We could pay you a consulting fee." A consulting fee. To manage my own father's money that they'd stolen from me. The balls on this guy were truly impressive. I'd have to think about that, I said. Right now, I'm just trying to process everything. Of course, Linda said quickly. Take all the time you need. This has been a shock for all of us. A shock. Sure it had. I stood up from the table. I think I'm going to lie down for a while. It's been a long day. Do you want me to bring you some dinner later? Linda asked. No, thanks. I'm not really hungry. I walked upstairs to our bedroom, the room I'd shared with my wife for over 2 decades. The room where she'd been planning my betrayal while lying next to me every night. The room where she'd probably been texting my brother while I slept. I closed the door behind me and sat on the edge of the bed. Through the floor, I could hear their voices starting up again. Quieter now, more relaxed. The difficult part was over. Frank had taken the news as well as could be expected. Poor Frank, so trusting, so naive. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a contact I'd added 6 months ago. Detective Mike Torres, Denver Police Department, Financial Crimes Division. We'd had several long conversations about elder fraud, asset manipulation, and the kind of evidence needed to build a solid case. I typed a quick text. The hook is set. They took the bait completely. Ready for phase 2. His reply came back immediately. Standing by. Documentation is solid on our end. Keep playing the victim. I deleted the text thread and put the phone away. Downstairs, the voices were getting louder again. Celebration mode was kicking in. They'd pulled it off. They'd stolen a fortune right out from under stupid Frank's nose, and he was just going to take it like the pathetic pushover they thought he was. Tomorrow, I'd start acting confused about some missing paperwork. Nothing too dramatic. Just a worried son trying to understand his father's final wishes. Just a helpful accountant who wanted to make sure all the legal details were handled properly. Just a man who'd spent 6 months learning exactly how to destroy people who thought they were smarter than everyone else. I closed my eyes and smiled. The funeral had gone perfectly. Now came the really fun part. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was upset. I hadn't been genuinely upset about anything in months. I was too busy running through the timeline in my head, checking every detail, making sure I hadn't missed anything. At 2 a.m., Linda was snoring softly beside me. The same woman who'd been faithfully cheating on me for 8 years, now dreaming about her newfound wealth. I wondered if she was dreaming about Gary too. I slipped out of bed and walked downstairs to my home office. The room where I'd spent countless hours over the years, managing our family finances, planning for retirement, building what I thought was our future together. The same room where I'd spent the last 6 months planning their destruction. I sat at my desk and opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a folder labeled Property Taxes 2023, boring enough that nobody would ever bother looking at it. But it didn't contain tax documents. It contained copies of everything I'd collected over the past 6 months. Bank statements showing large cash deposits to Gary's account that coincided with Dad's confused periods. Email printouts where Linda discussed their plan with Gary. Phone records showing hundreds of calls between them, including several that happened while I was at work. And Dad was supposedly alone with his visiting caretakers. Text messages I'd retrieved from Linda's phone using software that Kevin, ironically, had recommended to me when I told him I was worried about losing family photos. Dad, this app backs up everything automatically. You'll never lose anything important again. He was right about that. The crown jewel was a recording from Dad's hospital room, made with his full knowledge and consent. Linda and Gary discussing exactly how they'd convinced him to change his will, how they'd isolated me, and what they planned to do with the money once they got it. Frank will never figure it out, Linda's voice said clearly from the tiny digital recorder Dad had hidden in his bedside table. He's too trusting, too focused on being the good son to see what's really happening. Gary's laugh came through crystal clear. By the time he realizes what we've done, it'll be too late. The will is ironclad. Patterson made sure of that. What about the kids? They'll keep quiet. Kevin needs the money for that business idea of his. Sarah just wants to finish graduate school without debt. They're not going to rock the boat. And Frank? Frank will do what Frank always does, He'll accept it, rationalize it, and find a way to convince himself it's for the best. That's who he is. The family doormat. The family doormat. That was 6 months ago, before they knew that the family doormat had been recording everything. I closed the folder and put it back in the drawer. Tomorrow would be Friday. 3 days after the funeral. Time for me to start asking innocent questions about Dad's paperwork. The house was completely quiet now. Even Gary had finally gone home to his own place, a cramped apartment that he barely managed to afford on his unemployment checks. Soon he'd be moving somewhere much nicer. At least, that's what he thought. I walked to the kitchen and made myself a cup of coffee. Black, no sugar. My tastes had simplified considerably over the past 6 months. Everything had simplified, really. When you know exactly who you're dealing with, when all the pretense is stripped away, life becomes remarkably clear. Linda appeared in the doorway, wearing the pink robe I'd bought her for Christmas 2 years ago. Back when I still believed she loved me. "Frank, you're up late. Couldn't sleep." True enough. She patted over and put her arms around me from behind. "I know today was hard, honey, but we'll get through this together. Together." What an interesting choice of words. "I keep thinking about Dad," I said, wondering if there were signs I missed. Times when he tried to tell me something was wrong. I felt her stiffen slightly behind me. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. Just little things. Maybe he was more confused than I realized. Maybe someone was taking advantage of that confusion." "Frank," her voice was careful now. "What are you trying to say?" I turned around to face her. "I'm not trying to say anything. I'm just processing. Trying to understand how my father could cut me out of his will completely. Sometimes elderly people make decisions that don't make sense to us," she said. "It doesn't mean anyone was manipulating him." Manipulating him. She brought up the word, not me. Interesting. "You're probably right," I said. "I'm just overthinking things. You know how I get with numbers and details." She relaxed a little. "That's exactly right. Sometimes you need to just accept things instead of analyzing them to death." Accept things. The way I'd accepted 27 years of marriage. The way I'd accepted that my brother needed help getting back on his feet. The way I'd accepted that my children were just going through normal young adult phases. "I'll try," I said. "It's just hard." "I know." She kissed my cheek. "But you don't have to figure everything out tonight. Come back to bed." I followed her upstairs, playing the role of the confused, grieving son, the man who'd lost his father and his inheritance in the same day, the victim who needed comfort and support from his loving family. As we settled back into bed, Linda curled up against me the way she used to when we were young and actually in love, before Gary, before the lies, before everything fell apart. "Linda," I said softly. Do you still love me?" The question hung in the dark air between us. I felt her breathing change, felt her body tense against mine. "Of course I do," she whispered finally. "Why would you even ask that?" Why, indeed. Maybe because I'd heard her telling Gary that she couldn't wait to be free of her boring, predictable husband. Maybe because I'd read the texts where she called me a safe choice that became a prison. Maybe because I'd watched her lie to my face for 8 months while planning to steal my inheritance. "Just needed to hear it," I said. "Today made me feel like I don't really know anyone anymore." "You know me," she said, squeezing my hand. "You'll always know me." I squeezed back and closed my eyes. She was wrong about that. But she'd find out soon enough. 6 months ago, I was Frank Morrison, devoted son and family man. I had no idea that my life was a complete lie. Funny how quickly things can change when you're sitting in a hospital room at 3 in the morning, listening to your father confess that your family has been systematically destroying you for years. It was March 15th when Dad had his heart attack. I got the call at 2:47 a.m. from Linda, who was supposedly sleeping beside me, but was actually texting someone when the hospital called. "Frank, wake up. Your father's in the ER at Presbyterian St. Joseph. We need to get there right away." I threw on clothes and drove through empty Denver streets, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Dad was 78, and despite his tough exterior, his health had been declining. This could be it. This could be the phone call every adult child dreads. Linda was quiet during the drive, staring out the passenger window. I thought she was worried about Dad. Looking back, she was probably calculating how much his death would be worth. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and fear. Dad was stable but sedated, the doctor explained. The attack had been serious but not fatal. He'd need surgery in the morning and several days of observation. He's been asking for you, the nurse told me around 4 a.m. He seems very agitated about something. I went into his room alone. Linda had mysteriously needed to make some phone calls in the hallway, probably updating Gary on Dad's condition, or planning their next move. Dad's eyes opened when I sat down beside his bed. Even weak and hooked up to monitors, his gaze was sharp and focused. "Frank," he whispered. "Thank God. I need to tell you something. Dad, don't worry about anything right now. Just rest." He grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "No. Listen to me. There's something wrong. Something I should have told you months ago." I leaned closer. "What is it?" "Your wife and your brother." His voice was barely audible, but every word was clear. "They've been coming to see me, together, asking questions about my will, about my investments, telling me things about you." My blood went cold. "What kind of things?" "They said you were too busy with work to really care about family, that you'd probably just stick me in a nursing home if you had to take care of me alone. They said they wanted to help, that they could handle my affairs better than you could." I stared at him, feeling something fundamental shift in my chest. "Dad, that's not... I would never... I know that, son. I've always known that. But they were persistent, convincing, and I was getting confused sometimes, forgetting things. They made me doubt myself." The heart monitor next to his bed was beeping steadily, but each beep felt like a countdown. "What did you do?" "I signed some papers last month. Gary said they were just to make things easier, to help Linda manage my affairs if I got sicker. But Frank," his grip tightened on my wrist, "I think they tricked me." That's when he told me about his laptop, how Gary had helped him set up email accounts and online banking for convenience, how Linda had been so helpful with organizing his important documents, how they'd both been so concerned about his confusion and forgetfulness. "The laptop's in my bedroom closet," Dad whispered. "Password is your mother's birthday. Look at the emails, Frank. But be careful. They set up forwarding to include me on their conversations. They think I'm too confused to understand what they're saying." I spent the next 3 hours at Dad's bedside while he slept fitfully. Linda came and went, making more mysterious phone calls. When visiting hours officially started, Gary showed up with coffee and concerned expressions. "How's he doing, Frank?" Gary asked, settling into the chair on the other side of Dad's bed. "Stable," I said, watching my brother's face carefully. "The doctors think he'll make a full recovery." "That's great news," Linda said. "We were so worried." They'd been together when the call came, probably planning what they'd do if Dad didn't make it. "I was thinking," Gary said, stirring sugar into his coffee, "maybe this is a wake-up call. Dad's getting older, and these health scares are only going to get more frequent. Maybe it's time to talk about getting him some help." "What kind of help?" I asked. "You know, professional care. Someone who can manage his medications, make sure he's eating properly, handle his appointments. You're so busy with work." "Frank, it's not fair to expect you to handle everything." There it was, the setup. Get Dad confused and dependent on professional care that they would obviously volunteer to coordinate. Isolate him from me gradually, reasonably, lovingly. "I can handle Dad's care," I said. "Of course you can," Linda said quickly. "Gary didn't mean you couldn't. He just meant you shouldn't have to do it alone." I nodded and smiled, and played the appreciative family man. But inside, something told me Dad might be right about what was happening. That afternoon, I drove to Dad's house with my spare key. Linda thought I was going to pick up some of his personal items for the hospital. I was, but I was also going to check his laptop. The password worked on the first try. Mom's birthday, 07151943. What I found in his email folder confused me at first. Dozens of emails between Linda and Gary that had been automatically forwarded to Dad's account, because Gary had set up Dad's email to keep him in the loop. Messages discussing helping Dad and managing Frank's expectations. It took me 20 minutes of reading to understand what I was really looking at. One email from Linda to Gary stopped my heart. "He's more confused after the new medication. Perfect timing to bring up the will discussion. Frank won't suspect anything if we frame it as helping his poor, forgetful father organize his affairs." Gary's response: "The lawyer says the documents just need Dad's signature. I'll tell him it's for tax purposes. He trusts me more than Frank anyway. I've been working on that for months." I sat in Dad's living room, staring at the laptop screen, my hands shaking. This couldn't be real. My wife of 27 years and my brother couldn't be planning to steal my inheritance. But email after email confirmed it. They weren't just helping Dad. They were manipulating him. They'd been doing it for months, maybe years. I copied everything to a flash drive with trembling fingers. Then I drove back to the hospital in a daze. "Did you find it?" Dad whispered when the nurses were out of earshot. "I found something. But Dad, I need to understand. How long have you known?" "About 3 weeks. I started getting suspicious when they began visiting together all the time, asking the same questions about money. Then I realized the emails were being forwarded to me." His eyes were sharp. "They think I'm too senile to read my own email. What do we do?" Dad was quiet for a long moment. "Frank, if we confront them now, it's your word against theirs. You need proof they can't deny." That's when I made a decision that would define the next 6 months of my life. I couldn't confront them yet. I needed help. Professional help. The next morning, I called the Denver police non-emergency line and asked to speak with someone about financial elder abuse. They transferred me to Detective Mike Torres in the Financial Crimes Division. "Mr. Morrison," Torres said after I explained the situation, "what you're describing sounds like a complex fraud case. Do you have documentation?" "Some. Emails that were accidentally forwarded to my father. But I think they're still actively working on him, and I'm not sure what to do. If you're willing to cooperate, we can help you gather evidence properly. Legal evidence that will hold up in court." Torres explained that cases like this required patience and proper procedure. "You can't just confront them with emails and expect justice," he said. "We need to build an airtight case." That's how Frank Morrison, family doormat, became Frank Morrison, undercover investigator. It only took discovering that everyone I loved was actively working to destroy me. But it would take months of careful work with Detective Torres to build the case that would bring them down legally. Dad's recovery took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of learning how to be an investigator while playing the worried son. Detective Torres became my teacher, and my own son Kevin inadvertently became my tech support. "The most important thing," Torres explained during our first meeting at a coffee shop downtown, "is that everything we collect has to be admissible in court. That means we follow procedures, get proper authorizations, and document everything." He taught me about recording devices that were legal to use. "Since your father consents to recording conversations in his own home, anything he captures is legally admissible," Torres explained. "But you'll need proper equipment." That's where Kevin unknowingly helped. When I mentioned to him that I was worried about Dad's memory and wanted to help him keep track of important conversations, Kevin got excited about technology. "Dad, there's this app that automatically backs up everything. Calls, texts, even ambient recording for memory assistance," Kevin said enthusiastically. "It's designed for elderly care. Let me set it up on Grandpa's phone." Perfect. Kevin installed exactly what I needed while thinking he was helping his grandfather with memory issues. "They came again today," Dad would whisper when the nurses were busy. "Brought more papers for me to sign." "Did you sign them?" "I signed what Torres said was safe to sign. Refused the rest." Dad had gotten good at playing confused when it served our purposes. "Gary's getting frustrated. He thinks I'm becoming more senile." Perfect. Let them think he was declining mentally. It would make their manipulation more obvious to prosecutors later. The recordings Torres had taught us to make were pure gold. Hours of Linda and Gary discussing their plan with touching honesty. They really believed Dad was too out of it to understand what they were saying. "Once we get control of his accounts," Gary's voice came through clearly on one recording, "we can start moving money into safer investments. Frank will never know the difference." "What if he asks questions?" Linda's voice replied. "Frank doesn't ask questions. He just accepts what we tell him. He's been doing it for years." That one hurt, mainly because it was true. I had been accepting what they told me for years, too trusting, too focused on being the good husband and brother to see what was really happening. But not anymore. Detective Torres also taught me how to legally access financial records. As your father's son, and with his written consent, you can request copies of his bank statements, he explained. If there are joint accounts with your wife, you also have legal access to those records. I'd been busy at work during the day, which made my afternoon visits to Dad seem natural. What nobody knew was that I'd been using my accounting background and Torres' guidance to trace every transaction. Every account, every paper trail that Linda and Gary had created. The beauty of being a career accountant with police guidance is that you know exactly how money moves and where to look when people try to hide it. Legally, I found Gary's secret bank account, with Torres's help running legitimate financial background checks. Found the cash deposits that perfectly matched the timing of Dad's confused periods when he'd supposedly given Gary money for emergency repairs. Torres had obtained proper warrants for Linda's phone records after establishing probable cause. The emails forwarded to your father's account give us legal grounds, he explained. Everything we find from here is admissible. We found the insurance policies that Linda had convinced Dad to change, making her the beneficiary instead of me. Found the investment accounts that had been slowly drained and moved into joint accounts with Gary's name on them. Every crime needs evidence, and with Torres's guidance, we were building an unbeatable legal case. The hardest part was coming home every night and acting normal, sitting at the dinner table with Linda and the kids, listening to them talk about their days while knowing they were all complicit in robbing me blind. Kevin was the worst. My son, who I'd supported through college, who lived in our basement, rent-free, who I'd helped with every financial problem he'd ever had. One evening in early May, he actually had the balls to suggest I needed to be more understanding about Dad's condition. Grandpa's getting older, Dad. Maybe Uncle Gary and Mom are just trying to help. Help with what? I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. You know, managing his money. Making sure he doesn't get confused and make mistakes. It's actually pretty common with elderly people. Common. Like this was something Kevin had researched instead of something Gary had coached him to say. I'm sure they have Dad's best interests at heart, I replied. Sarah nodded earnestly. Plus, Uncle Gary really understands construction and property management. If Grandpa needs repairs or maintenance, Gary knows how to handle contractors and stuff. Property management. Dad's house was perfectly maintained. The only repairs Gary had been handling were fictional ones designed to justify cash payments. You're both right, I said. I'm lucky to have family who cares so much. They smiled and went back to their phones, satisfied that Dad was properly supported, and I was properly grateful. Neither of them had visited Dad more than twice since his heart attack. Neither of them had offered to help with his care in any meaningful way. But they were perfectly happy to support Gary and Linda's helpful management of his affairs. That night, I lay awake next to my cheating wife and thought about the Frank Morrison I used to be. Trusting, naive, willing to believe the best about people, because I couldn't imagine being cruel enough to systematically destroy someone who loved me. That Frank Morrison was gone forever. In his place was someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. Someone who understood that nice guys don't finish last because they're not good enough. They finish last because they're playing against people who've thrown out the rulebook entirely. By June, I had enough evidence to destroy them all. Bank records obtained through legitimate channels, emails legally forwarded to Dad's account, recorded conversations with Dad's full consent, documented lies, financial fraud spanning multiple accounts and several years. Detective Torres had reviewed everything and confirmed that the case was solid. This is elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement, he told me during one of our private meetings. And every piece of evidence was obtained legally. We're talking serious felony charges for Linda and Gary. Prison time. What about my kids? They're accessories, but probably not criminal conspirators. They might face some consequences, but nothing like what your wife and brother are looking at. That's when Dad had the brilliant idea that sealed their fate. Let's give them what they want, he said during one of my visits. Let me change my will officially, leaving everything to Linda and Gary. Make it completely legal and legitimate. Dad, that's exactly what they're trying to accomplish. He smiled, and for the first time since his heart attack, he looked like his old self. Trust me, Frank. Sometimes you have to let people win before you can destroy them completely. That's how we set the trap. Dad visited his lawyer in July, officially changing his will to leave everything to Linda and Gary. Completely legal, properly witnessed, impossible to contest. What Linda and Gary didn't know was that Dad had also created a series of trusts and legal documents that would transfer ownership of his assets to me 30 days after his death. Legal loopholes that I'd spent years learning about in my accounting career, designed to protect assets from estate taxes and family disputes. The will they were so proud of would give them exactly 30 days to enjoy their victory before losing everything and facing felony charges. Dad died peacefully in his sleep on September 10th, 3 months after setting our trap. His last words to me were, "Don't let them off easy, son. People like that only understand consequences." Now it was September 13th. The funeral was over. The will had been read. Linda and Gary thought they'd won the lottery. Tomorrow I'd start asking innocent questions about some missing paperwork. Nothing dramatic, just a confused son trying to understand his father's final arrangements. In 30 days, they'd understand exactly what those arrangements really meant. The family doormat was about to become their worst nightmare. Saturday morning after the funeral, I woke up to the sound of celebration downstairs. Quiet celebration, but celebration nonetheless. Coffee brewing, voices murmuring excitedly, the occasional laugh that was quickly hushed. I stayed in bed, listening to my family plan their future with my father's money. "We need to be smart about this." Gary's voice drifted up from the kitchen. "Move slowly. Don't make any sudden changes that might look suspicious." "How long before we can access the accounts?" Linda asked. Patterson said the estate process could take a few weeks, but Dad set most of it up as joint accounts anyway. "We should have access to the liquid assets within days." Liquid assets. Gary had learned some new vocabulary over the past few months. "What about Frank?" That was Kevin's voice. "Frank will be fine," Linda replied. "We'll make sure he's taken care of. Maybe give him enough for a small house somewhere, help him get back on his feet." Get back on my feet. Like I was the one who needed charity. Like I was the one who'd been unemployed for 3 years or living in other people's basements. "He's going to ask questions," Sarah said. "Dad's not stupid. He'll want to know why Grandpa cut him out completely." "Let him ask questions," Gary said dismissively. "The will is legal. There's nothing he can do about it." I smiled into my pillow. Gary was right about that. The will was completely legal. That wasn't the problem they should be worried about. I got dressed and went downstairs, playing the role of the grieving son. They all looked up when I entered the kitchen, their excited chatter immediately shifting to expressions of concern and sympathy. "Morning, Dad," Sarah said softly. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck." True enough, though not for the reasons she thought. Linda poured me a cup of coffee without being asked. Such a thoughtful wife. "Did you sleep at all?" "A little. I keep thinking about Dad, wondering if there was something I could have done differently." "There wasn't," Kevin said firmly. "You were a good son, Dad. Grandpa just made his own decisions." His own decisions. What a diplomatic way to describe months of systematic manipulation. Gary cleared his throat. "Frank, I know yesterday was hard, but we need to start thinking about practical things. The house, Dad's belongings, the funeral expenses." "Of course." I sat down at the table, wrapping my hands around my coffee mug. "Whatever needs to be done. I was thinking I could handle most of the estate business," Gary continued. "You know, work with Patterson, deal with the banks, that sort of thing. Give you time to grieve without worrying about paperwork." How thoughtful. Gary wanted to handle all the financial details personally. I wondered if he'd already started planning which bank accounts to drain first. "That's very generous," I said. "But I should probably be involved. Dad always talked to me about his finances. I know where everything is." I caught the quick glance between Gary and Linda, a flash of concern, quickly covered. "Of course," Gary said smoothly. "I just meant the administrative stuff, the boring details. You shouldn't have to deal with that right now." "Actually," Linda added, "Gary's already been helping your father with a lot of the account management. It might be easier for him to just continue with what he was already doing." Account management. Such a professional way to describe fraud. "I didn't realize Gary was helping with Dad's accounts," I said, letting confusion creep into my voice. "When did that start?" Another glance between them. This one lasted a little longer. "Oh, you know," Gary waved his hand vaguely. "Dad asked for some help a few months ago. Nothing major. Just organizing some paperwork, making sure bills got paid on time. He was getting a little forgetful. Forgetful. The same word they'd used to justify every piece of manipulation. "I wish I'd known," I said. "I could have helped too." "We didn't want to worry you," Linda said quickly. "You've been so busy with work. And your father specifically asked us to handle it quietly. He was embarrassed about needing help. Embarrassed. Dad had been many things. but embarrassed about asking for help wasn't one of them. He'd never been too proud to admit when he needed assistance. "Maybe I should call Patterson on Monday," I said thoughtfully. "Ask him to walk me through exactly what Dad set up. I want to make sure I understand everything." The temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. That might not be necessary," Gary said carefully. "Patterson's already explained everything pretty clearly. The will is straightforward." "I know, but Dad always said the details matter. You know how he was about making sure everything was documented properly." "Dad," Kevin said, "maybe you should just focus on healing right now instead of worrying about legal stuff." Healing. My 26-year-old son was advising me to focus on healing instead of understanding my father's estate. The same son who'd never shown the slightest interest in financial responsibility or legal documentation. "You might be right," I said. "It's just hard to accept that Dad would cut me out without explanation." "Maybe there was an explanation," Sarah suggested quietly. "Maybe he tried to tell you something and you missed it." I stared at my daughter. Sweet, innocent Sarah, suggesting that I'd somehow failed to notice my father trying to communicate his final wishes to me. The girl I'd raised, supported, loved unconditionally for 24 years. "Maybe," I said. "I'll probably never know for sure." Relief washed over the room. Frank was accepting the situation. Frank was giving up. Frank was going to be the same pushover he'd always been, even in the face of complete betrayal. "The important thing," Linda said, reaching over to squeeze my hand, "is that we're here for you. Family sticks together." Family sticks together. Yes, it certainly did. They'd been sticking together quite well for the past 8 years. Unfortunately for them, they'd forgotten that I was family too. "I love you guys," I said, looking around the table at each of them. "I don't know what I'd do without you." And in that moment, looking at their satisfied, relieved faces, I meant every word. I loved them enough to spend 6 months planning their destruction instead of just walking away. I loved them enough to make sure they faced consequences for what they'd done instead of just letting them get away with it. That's what real love looked like. Not the fake sentiment they'd been showing me for years, but the hard work of holding people accountable for their choices. In 24 days, they'd find out exactly how much I loved them. Monday morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. Grief, I told my boss. Needed a few days to handle my father's affairs. He was very understanding. Told me to take all the time I needed. Time was exactly what I needed. At 9 a.m., I drove to Patterson's law office, where Linda and Gary were scheduled to meet about accessing Dad's accounts. I parked across the street and waited. They arrived together in Gary's truck, both dressed nicely, both carrying folders of paperwork, both looking like people about to collect a fortune. At 10:30, they came out looking pleased with themselves. Mission accomplished. They'd probably walked out with account numbers, access codes, and authorization to start moving money around. Perfect. I waited until they were gone, then walked into Patterson's office. "Frank," the lawyer said, standing up when his secretary showed me in. "I'm surprised to see you. How are you holding up?" "About as well as expected," I replied. "I was hoping you could help me understand something about Dad's will." "Of course. Please, sit down." I settled into the leather chair across from his desk. The same chair where I'd heard my father's will read just 4 days ago. The same chair where I'd played the devastated son so convincingly. "I've been thinking about Dad's decision," I said slowly. "And I keep coming back to the same question. When did he actually decide to change his will?" Patterson consulted a file on his desk. "The new will was executed on July 15th. Your father came in specifically to make these changes. July 15th. 2 weeks after Dad and I had our final planning session. 2 weeks after he'd decided to give Linda and Gary exactly what they wanted before destroying them completely. Had he talked about changing his will before that?" "Well," Patterson hesitated. "There had been some preliminary discussions. Your brother Gary had contacted me in May about helping your father organize his estate planning. Gary had contacted Patterson, not Dad. Gary had initiated the legal process that resulted in the will that gave him everything. Did Dad seem confused when he signed the new will?" Patterson's expression became carefully professional. "Your father seemed very clear about his intentions, Frank. He specifically stated that he believed Linda and Gary would be better suited to manage his assets." "Did he say why?" "He mentioned that you'd been busy with work and that Linda and Gary had been very helpful with his day-to-day affairs. He felt they had a better understanding of his needs. Understanding of his needs. Right, I see. I nodded thoughtfully. And the accounts that Linda and Gary are accessing today? Those were all properly transferred? Everything was handled according to your father's explicit instructions, Patterson assured me. The joint accounts, the investment portfolios, the life insurance policies, all properly designated. What about the house? The deed will be transferred to Linda and Gary within 30 days, as specified in the will. 30 days. The exact timeline Dad and I had planned for. Mr. Patterson, I said, leaning forward slightly, I need to ask you something confidential. If I suspected that my father had been manipulated or coerced into changing his will, would there be any way to investigate that? Patterson's demeanor shifted immediately. That's a very serious allegation, Frank. Do you have evidence of coercion? I don't know. Maybe. Dad seemed different these last few months. More confused, more suspicious of me. It was like someone was poisoning him against me. Undue influence cases are extremely difficult to prove, Patterson said carefully. You'd need clear evidence that someone manipulated your father's decision-making process. What kind of evidence? Documentation, recordings, witnesses who could testify to inappropriate pressure being applied, medical records showing diminished capacity, documentation, recordings, witnesses. I had all of that and more. How long would I have to contest the will? 90 days from the date of probate. But Frank, you should understand that will contests are expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. They tend to destroy families. Destroy families? This family had been destroyed 8 years ago when my wife started sleeping with my brother, and my children decided to help them steal my inheritance. I was just making the destruction official. I appreciate the advice, I said, standing up. Right now I'm just trying to understand what happened. Of course. And Frank, if you do find evidence of wrongdoing, please bring it to me immediately. I would never knowingly participate in elder abuse. Elder abuse. Patterson had used the exact phrase Detective Torres had used to describe Linda and Gary's crimes. I shook his hand and left the office, driving slowly through downtown Denver while I considered my next move. Linda and Gary were probably at the bank right now, setting up their access to Dad's accounts. They'd be careful at first, maybe just checking balances, understanding what they'd won. But greed is a powerful motivator. Soon they'd start moving larger amounts, making investments, paying off debts, living like people who'd just inherited $2.3 million. That evening at dinner, they were practically glowing. Frank, Linda said as she served the meatloaf, I talked to Gary today about your father's estate. We want you to know that we're going to make sure you're taken care of. What do you mean? Well, Gary said, cutting his food with obvious satisfaction. Linda and I discussed it, and we think Dad would want us to share some of the inheritance with you. Family should stick together, share some of the inheritance. How magnanimous. That's very kind, I said, but Dad made his wishes clear. I don't want to take money he didn't intend for me to have. Don't be ridiculous, Linda said firmly. You're his son. Of course he'd want you to benefit. Maybe he would, I agreed. But the will says what it says. Kevin looked up from his phone. Dad, don't be stubborn about this. Uncle Gary and Mom are trying to help. Stubborn. That was a new one. How much were you thinking? I asked. Gary and Linda exchanged a look. We thought maybe $50,000, Gary said. Enough for you to get a nice apartment. Maybe take some time to figure out your next steps. $50,000 out of $2.3 million, and it's about 2% of what they'd stolen from me. Next steps? I asked. Well, Linda said carefully, this house is going to be too expensive for you to maintain on your own. The mortgage, the utilities, the maintenance. It makes sense for you to downsize. Downsize. They wanted me out of my own house so they could either sell it or move in themselves. Where would I go? There are some nice apartment complexes near your old office, Gary suggested. Close to public transportation. Affordable rent. You could start fresh. Start fresh. At 54. After 27 years of marriage and 30 years in the same house. I'll think about it, I said. Don't think too long, Linda said with a smile. The sooner you make the transition, the easier it'll be. The transition from husband and father to discarded family member accepting charity from the people who'd robbed him. That night, I lay in bed listening to Linda's breathing and thinking about transitions. She was right that one was coming, but not the transition she expected. In 21 days, my loving family would discover that their victim had been playing chess while they were playing checkers. In 21 days, they'd learn that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the most dangerous. In 21 days, Frank Morrison was going to show them exactly what starting fresh really looked like. By the end of the week, Linda and Gary had gotten comfortable with their new wealth. Too comfortable. I came home Wednesday to find Gary's truck in my driveway and voices coming from my home office. Through the window, I could see them at my desk, paperwork spread out, calculators running, planning their future with Dad's money. "Frank," Linda called when she heard me come in. "We're in the office." I walked in to find them surrounded by investment brochures, real estate listings, and bank statements, my father's bank statements, which they were now authorized to access. "What's all this?" "We're just trying to get organized," Gary explained, not looking the least bit guilty about rifling through my personal space. "Figure out the best way to manage Dad's assets." Dad's assets. They'd already started thinking of the money as theirs. "Looks like you've got everything under control," I said. "Actually," Linda said, "we wanted to talk to you about something. We've been thinking about that $50,000 we discussed." "What about it?" Gary leaned back in my desk chair, my chair, in my office, and folded his hands. "We think it might be better to structure it differently. Instead of giving you cash up front, maybe we could help with your expenses for a while. Rent, utilities, that sort of thing, instead of giving me cash." They'd already decided they didn't trust me with a lump sum of my own father's money. "Why the change?" "It's just more practical," Linda said. "This way you don't have to worry about budgeting or managing a large amount all at once." They didn't want me to have access to enough money to hire lawyers or private investigators. They wanted to keep me dependent on their monthly payments, grateful for their generosity, unable to cause trouble. "That makes sense," I said. "Very thoughtful of you." Gary smiled. The same smile he'd been giving me for 8 years, while he was screwing my wife and plotting to steal my inheritance. "We also found a great apartment for you," Linda said, pulling out a printed listing. 2 bedrooms, nice kitchen, washer and dryer hookups. The rent's only $1,200 a month. Only $1,200 a month. For a 2-bedroom apartment when I currently lived in a 4-bedroom house that was paid off. "When would I need to move?" "Well," Gary said, "the sooner the better, really. This house is going to need some work before we can decide what to do with it." What to do with it? They hadn't even officially inherited it yet, and they were already making plans for my home. "What kind of work?" "You know, updates, maybe knock out some walls, modernize the kitchen." "Gary's great with that stuff," Linda said. "We thought we might turn it into a rental property." "A rental property." They wanted to kick me out of my house so they could rent it to strangers for profit. "That sounds like a solid investment strategy," I said. Over the next few days, I watched them get bolder. Gary started leaving tools in my garage for the upcoming renovations. Linda began measuring rooms and talking about paint colors. Kevin and Sarah started boxing up family photos and personal items to help Dad with the transition. They weren't waiting for the estate to clear probate. They weren't waiting for legal ownership to transfer. They were acting like people who owned everything already and were just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. On Sunday, Gary brought over a rental truck. "Thought we could start moving some of your stuff," he explained when I found him loading my tools into the back. "Get a head start on the apartment. My tools. 30 years of collecting quality equipment for home maintenance and repairs. Tools I'd bought with my own money, in my own garage, that Gary was now loading into a truck." "Which tools are you taking?" I asked. "Just the duplicates," Gary said. "Stuff you won't need in an apartment. No point in having 2 sets of everything. Duplicates." Gary was deciding what I needed and what was extra. "Makes sense," I said. "Apartment living is definitely different." That afternoon, I called Detective Torres. "How's it going, Frank?" "They're getting greedy, moving faster than we expected." "Good. Greedy people make mistakes." "What are they doing?" I told him about the tools, the apartment, the rental property plans, the way they were already spending and planning as if Dad's money belonged to them. "Any access to Dad's accounts yet?" As of yesterday, they withdrew $15,000 in cash. Gary bought a new truck. Linda bought some jewelry. They're also looking at vacation rentals in Colorado Springs. Perfect. Keep documenting everything. Photos, receipts, anything that shows them spending your father's money before the estate is officially settled. How much longer? 2 more weeks until the trust documents kick in. Then we'll have them on fraud, theft, conspiracy, and about 6 other felonies. 2 more weeks. I could last 2 more weeks watching them celebrate my destruction. That evening, Linda made my favorite dinner. Pot roast with vegetables, the meal she'd cooked for special occasions throughout our marriage. She even opened a bottle of wine. "What's the occasion?" I asked. "No occasion. I just thought we should celebrate family." She raised her glass. "To new beginnings, new beginnings." To Linda, that meant freedom from her boring husband and a life of luxury with my brother. To me, it meant something entirely different. "To new beginnings," I agreed, clinking my glass against hers. I smiled and toasted my loving wife, thinking about how much she was going to hate her new beginning when it finally arrived. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, exactly 13 days after the funeral. Linda was in the shower when my phone rang, so she didn't hear Detective Torres delivering the news that would change everything. "Frank, we need to move up our timeline. Gary just tried to wire $50,000 to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands." I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. "Offshore?" "Money laundering. He's trying to hide assets before anyone can track them. We can't wait any longer. What do you need me to do? Can you get them all together this afternoon? At your house? Make it seem natural, like a family meeting or something." "I think I can manage that." "Good. We'll be there at 4 p.m. with warrants. Make sure you're not in the room when we arrive." After Torres hung up, I sat in the quiet bedroom listening to Linda humming in the shower. She sounded happy, probably thinking about her new life with Gary, funded by my father's money. Today, her humming would stop forever. I got dressed and went downstairs to make coffee. Gary was already in my kitchen, reading the newspaper at my table like he owned the place, which, according to Dad's will, he almost did. "Morning, Frank. Sleep well?" "Like a baby." True enough. For the first time in 6 months, I'd slept peacefully. "Linda and I were talking last night," Gary said, not looking up from the sports page. "We think it's time for that family meeting we've been discussing. You know, make some final decisions about the house, your apartment, that sort of thing." Perfect. Gary was going to arrange his own arrest. "Sounds good. When were you thinking?" "This afternoon, say, around 4. Kevin and Sarah should be here too." "Make it official." "That works for me." Gary smiled and went back to his newspaper, completely oblivious that he'd just scheduled the destruction of his life. Linda came downstairs a few minutes later, wearing the blue dress I'd bought her for our anniversary last year. She looked beautiful, like the woman I'd fallen in love with 29 years ago, before Gary, before the lies, before the— "Morning, honey," she said, kissing my cheek. "Gary told you about this afternoon?" "He did. It'll be good to get everything settled." "I know this is hard for you," Linda said, pouring herself coffee. "Losing your father, having to move, starting over. But Frank, I really think this could be a good thing, a chance for you to build something new. Build something new." Yes, I was definitely going to be building something new. Just not what she expected. The day dragged by slowly. I spent the morning at the bank, making some final arrangements. The afternoon at the hardware store, buying supplies for a project I'd been planning. Everything normal, everything routine. Frank Morrison, running errands like any other Tuesday. At 3:30, I called Kevin and Sarah. "Family meeting at 4, I told them. "Uncle Gary and Mom want to finalize the house situation." They both agreed to come, probably eager to see their father finally accept his fate and move into his little apartment like a good, defeated ex-patriarch. At 3:45, I was sitting in my living room when 3 unmarked police cars pulled up across the street. Detective Torres got out of the lead car, along with 2 other detectives and a uniformed officer. At 3:50, Gary's truck pulled into my driveway. He and Linda got out, both carrying folders of paperwork, both looking like people about to close the biggest deal of their lives. At 3:55, Kevin and Sarah arrived together in Kevin's car. At 3:58, I walked out my back door and around to the side of the house, where I could watch through the living room window but wouldn't be visible from inside. At 4 p.m. exactly, Detective Torres knocked on my front door. Through the window, I watched Gary answer it with a confused expression. "Can I help you?" "Denver Police, Detective Torres. We have warrants for the arrest of Linda Morrison and Gary Morrison on charges of elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy." The look on Gary's face was everything I'd hoped it would be. Confusion, then disbelief, then pure terror as the reality of the situation crashed down on him. "There must be some mistake." Linda's voice came clearly through the glass. "We haven't done anything wrong, ma'am. You have the right to remain silent." I watched my wife of 27 years being handcuffed in my living room. Watched my brother realize that his plan had blown up in his face. Watched Kevin and Sarah staring in shock as their world collapsed around them. Sarah was crying. Kevin was demanding to know what was happening. Gary was shouting about lawyers and false accusations. Linda, to her credit, was quiet. She stood there in her handcuffs, looking around the room like she was trying to understand how everything had gone wrong so quickly. That's when she looked toward the window and saw me standing outside. Our eyes met through the glass, and I watched understanding dawn on her face. She realized, in that moment, that I'd known all along. That I'd been planning this. That Frank Morrison, the family doormat, had destroyed them all. I raised my hand and gave her a little wave. Her mouth opened in shock, and she started to say something, but Detective Torres was already leading her toward the door. As they walked Gary and Linda to the police cars, I came back inside through the front door. "Dad!" Sarah ran to me, tears streaming down her face. "What's happening? Why are they arresting Mom and Uncle Gary?" Kevin stood frozen in the middle of the living room, his face pale. "This doesn't make sense. There has to be a mistake." I put my arms around my daughter and felt genuine sadness for the first time in months. Not for Linda and Gary. They deserved everything that was happening to them. But for Kevin and Sarah, who were about to learn that their entire family had been built on lies. "Sit down," I told them gently. "Both of you. There's something you need to know." "No," Sarah pulled back, shaking her head. "Whatever you think happened, you're wrong. Mom wouldn't do anything criminal." Kevin's voice was sharp. "Dad, if you did something to set them up, if you planted evidence or—" "Kevin." I looked at my son steadily. "Sit down and listen." For the next hour I started with the basics. The emails Gary had accidentally forwarded to Dad's account. The recordings made with Dad's consent. The financial records Torres had obtained with proper warrants. "That's impossible," Kevin said after each piece of evidence. "Uncle Gary was helping Grandpa. Mom was taking care of him." Sarah was crying harder. "Dad, please stop. This is crazy. You're making it sound like Mom is some kind of criminal mastermind." I showed them the bank records. The cash withdrawals that coincided with Dad's confused periods. The insurance policies changed without my knowledge. "These could be misunderstandings," Kevin insisted, but his voice was getting shakier. Then I played them one of the recordings. Linda's voice came through clearly. "Frank will never figure it out. He's too trusting. Too focused on being the good son to see what's really happening." Sarah's face crumpled. Kevin went completely silent. Gary's laugh followed. "By the time he realizes what we've done, it'll be too late. The will is ironclad." "No," Sarah whispered. No, this isn't real." Kevin stood up and started pacing. Maybe they thought they were protecting Grandpa from something. Maybe they had a good reason. "Kevin, listen to the rest." I played Gary's voice. "Frank will do what Frank always does. He'll accept it, rationalize it, and find a way to convince himself it's for the best. That's who he is. The family doormat." Kevin stopped pacing. His hands were shaking. For the next hour, I walked them through everything. Every lie, every manipulation, every dollar stolen. I watched my children's world collapse in real time. Sarah went through denial, anger, bargaining. Maybe if we talk to them, maybe they can explain. Maybe there's something we don't understand. Kevin just sat in shocked silence, staring at documents that proved his mother was a criminal. "Did you know?" I asked them finally. "Were you part of this?" "No," Sarah shouted. "I would never." "Dad, how can you even ask that?" Kevin's voice was barely a whisper. "I knew Uncle Gary was helping Grandpa, and I thought that was good, because you were always so busy with work. But I didn't know they were stealing. I knew Mom and Uncle Gary talked a lot, Sarah said through her tears, and I thought it was weird how much time they spent together. But I never thought Mom would cheat on you. I never thought she'd steal. I believed them. Their shock was too genuine, too devastating to be fake. What happens to us now? Kevin asked, looking lost. What happens to our family? I don't know, I said honestly. Your mother will go to prison. Gary will go to prison. You two will have to decide what kind of relationship you want to have with me after everything that's happened. What do you mean? Sarah looked confused. I mean, you've spent months defending them while they robbed me blind. I don't know if you can forgive me for destroying your mother, and I don't know if I can forget that you chose their side without ever asking questions. The silence stretched between us. These were my children, but they'd become strangers without me realizing it. I'm sorry, Kevin said finally. I should have asked questions. I should have paid more attention. I'm sorry too, Sarah whispered. I believed what I wanted to believe. It would take months of difficult conversations, therapy sessions, and painful honesty before we could rebuild anything resembling a family relationship. But at least now, we could start with the truth. Outside, the last police car was pulling away, taking Linda and Gary to jail where they'd wait for arraignment. Tomorrow, the newspapers would report their arrest. Their friends and co-workers would learn what they'd done. In 24 hours, the trust documents would officially transfer ownership of Dad's assets to me. Every penny Linda and Gary thought they'd stolen would come back where it belonged. Frank Morrison, the family doormat, had just won the biggest victory of his life. And the best part? This was only the beginning. The arraignment was scheduled for Friday morning at 9 a.m. I got to the courthouse early, dressed in my best suit, carrying a folder full of documents that would ensure Linda and Gary spent the next several years in prison. But I wasn't there as a witness. I was there as something much more powerful. The courtroom was packed. News of the arrests had spread quickly through our neighborhood, and people were curious about the quiet accountant whose family had tried to rob him blind. Detective Torres sat in the front row, along with Patterson the lawyer and several other officials. Linda and Gary were brought in wearing orange jumpsuits, their hands cuffed in front of them. They looked older somehow, diminished by the reality of their situation. Gary's eyes swept the courtroom and landed on me. His expression shifted from confusion to recognition to something approaching fear. Linda followed his gaze and saw me sitting calmly in the third row, folder in hand, looking like a man who had all the time in the world. Your Honor, the prosecutor began, the defendants are charged with elder abuse, financial fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, and money laundering. The state has substantial evidence. I listened to the charges being read, thinking about the journey that had brought us here. 6 months ago, I was Frank Morrison, devoted husband and father. Now I was Frank Morrison, the man who'd outsmarted everyone who thought he was stupid. The state requests that bail be denied, the prosecutor continued. The defendants have already attempted to move large sums of money offshore, indicating flight risk. Gary's lawyer, a public defender who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, stood up. Your Honor, my clients are longtime residents of Denver with strong community ties. Mr. Morrison owns a small business, and Mrs. Morrison has been a devoted wife and mother for over 25 years. Devoted wife. That was an interesting way to describe 8 years of adultery and fraud. Furthermore, the lawyer continued, there appears to be a family dispute at the heart of these charges. My clients maintain that they were acting in the best interests of an elderly relative who had specifically asked for their help managing his affairs. That's when I stood up. Your Honor, I said clearly, may I approach the bench? The judge looked surprised. And you are? Frank Morrison, the victim's son and the primary target of the defendant's crimes. The prosecutor looked startled. This wasn't part of the planned proceedings. Your Honor, I continued, there's something the court should know about the deceased's estate and the defendant's current legal standing. I walked to the front of the courtroom, acutely aware that every eye in the room was on me. Linda and Gary were staring at me with expressions of growing dread. I handed the judge my folder. These are trust documents executed by my father 6 months ago. They establish a 30-day waiting period after his death before any beneficiaries can take permanent control of his assets. The judge opened the folder and began reading. His eyebrows rose as he scanned the documents. Your Honor, I said, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. As of yesterday, 30 days have elapsed since my father's death. According to these legally binding documents, ownership of his entire estate reverts to me. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Gary's mouth fell open. Linda's face went completely white. Furthermore, I continued, every penny that the defendants withdrew from my father's accounts over the past month was stolen property. They have been spending money they never legally owned. The judge looked up from the documents. Mr. Morrison, are you saying that your father's will was conditional? No, Your Honor. The will was genuine and legal. But my father was smarter than the people trying to manipulate him. He set up a trust structure that would expose anyone who was stealing from him while giving legitimate beneficiaries time to make proper arrangements. I turned to face Linda and Gary directly. My father knew you were robbing him, I said clearly. He knew about the affair, the manipulation, the fake emergencies that justified cash withdrawals. He knew everything. Linda started to cry. Not the fake tears she'd been using for months, but real, broken sobs of someone whose entire world was crashing down. And so did I continued. For 6 months I've been documenting every lie you told, every dollar you stole, every time you looked me in the eye and pretended to care about my family. Gary found his voice. Frank, you don't understand. We were trying to help. Your father was confused, and we just wanted... You wanted $2.3 million that didn't belong to you, I interrupted. You wanted to destroy my marriage, steal my inheritance, and throw me away like garbage. The only thing you didn't want was to face the consequences. I turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I'm here to ensure that justice is served. Not just for my father, but for every elderly person whose family thinks they can be manipulated and robbed without consequences. The judge nodded slowly. Mr. Morrison, these documents appear to be in order. Are you requesting that the prosecution proceed with all charges? Yes, Your Honor, and I'm prepared to testify to ensure that the defendants receive the maximum sentence allowed by law. Gary's lawyer stood up frantically. Your Honor, this changes everything. If the will was conditional, then my clients may not have knowingly committed. Your clients withdrew $50,000 in cash, I said. They bought cars, jewelry, and vacation packages with money from accounts they didn't own. They attempted to wire funds to offshore accounts to avoid detection. Whether they knew about the trust conditions is irrelevant. They committed fraud. The judge set bail at $500,000 each. Neither Linda nor Gary could make bail, which meant they'd sit in jail until trial. As they were led away, Linda turned back to look at me one more time. Frank, she called out desperately, please. We can work this out. We're still family. No, I said calmly. We're not. Outside the courthouse, Detective Torres shook my hand. Hell of a performance in there, Frank. You really are full of surprises. My father always said that quiet people are dangerous because you never see them coming. What's next for you? I looked out at the Denver skyline, thinking about the house I'd get to keep, the inheritance that was rightfully mine, and the future I could finally build on my own terms. Now I get to find out what my life looks like when it's actually mine, I said. 3 months later, Linda and Gary were convicted on all charges. Linda got 4 years in federal prison. Gary got 6 years, plus restitution that would keep him paying me back until he was 70. Kevin and Sarah eventually forgave me for destroying their mother. It took time and therapy and a lot of difficult conversations, but they came to understand that I hadn't destroyed anything. I'd just stopped pretending that the destruction hadn't already happened. I kept the house, paid off the mortgage with Dad's money, and turned it into the home I'd always wanted it to be. No more walking on eggshells, no more wondering who was lying to me. Just peace, quiet, and the satisfaction of knowing that good people can win when they're smart enough to fight dirty. The last laugh, as it turned out, really was mine. Frank Morrison, family doormat, was dead and buried. In his place was Frank Morrison, the man who'd learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting mad. It's getting even. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button.